Good afternoon, and welcome everyone to the third virtual meeting of the Northern Tier Passenger Rail Study Working Group. My name is Michaela Niles. I'm the Mass DOT project manager for this effort, and I'm joined today by members of the consultant team. I'd like to thank you all for joining us and for taking the time to be with us today, and to thank our working group members in attendance, including the elected officials and members of their staff on the call today. So before we launch into today's presentation, I'd like to open with a few procedures for today's meeting. First, working group members will have the opportunity to ask questions or share comments at points during the presentation. To participate, you may use the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, or if you're participating by phone, you may dial *9. We will then call your name so that you may share your comment or question. And we ask that you please keep your microphone muted unless speaking, and ask that all speakers begin by stating their name. And this will benefit everyone in attendance, especially those who are participating by phone today. Working group members will be able to share their video. You may keep your video on or off, but the main request is to minimize distractions for others who are viewing the presentation. And members of the public in attendance may submit questions or comments at any time in writing using the Q&A, and meeting staff will address them as time allows at the end of the presentation. You can view closed captions by clicking the closed captions feature and selecting either show subtitle or view full transcript. Show subtitle will display captions at the bottom of your screen, and view full transcript will display the meeting's audio transcription in a window to the right. And if you need any technical assistance, please contact Zoom technical support at 888-799-9666. Please also note that this meeting is being recorded. The Massachusetts Department of Transportation may choose to retain and distribute the video, still images, audio, and/or chat transcript. And by continuing attendance with this virtual meeting, you are consenting to participate in a recorded event. All recordings and chat and Q&A transcripts will be considered a public record. If you're not comfortable being recorded, please turn off your camera, keep your microphone muted, and refrain from utilizing the Q&A. And finally, all questions and comments are welcomed and appreciated. We do request, however, that folks refrain from any disrespectful comments. So now moving to today's agenda. We will provide an overview of the study process and review the public workshop from earlier this year. And then from there, we will present the phase 2 alternatives development and evaluation, and then open up the floor for working group discussion. And finally, we will outline next steps and have open up the floor for public comment. And so as a little bit of background on this study effort, as we get into a little bit of the overview, the Massachusetts legislature directed MassDOT to conduct a study of the feasibility of rail access between North Adams and Boston. And in fulfillment of this directive, this conceptual planning study seeks to assess the economic and environmental benefits, as well as any associated implementation challenges, and identify all necessary improvements to support restored passenger rail service along the Northern Tier. And so now moving to an overview of the study process, this chart outlines some of the study tasks that have been involved, with each step building upon the previous one, with public participation serving as the foundation of the study, which will be carried throughout. And as I mentioned, today we'll be discussing the phase 2 alternatives development and analysis, and those tasks 5 and 6. And at the conclusion of these tasks, recommendations will be developed, and all of this information will be documented in a draft final report, which will be released for public comment and then finalized in a final report. And so just to cover some of the goals and objectives of this study, these were developed based on feedback that was received at the onset of the study. And these goals are to support economic development along the study corridor, to promote transportation equity, and to minimize the impacts of transportation on public health and the environment. And so with that, I will now turn it over to Anna Berry, project manager for the consultant team. Anna?
Thank you, Michaela. Yes, we will do a brief review of the public workshop that we had in January to tee up the rest of the discussion. So as you may recall, we set up the study process to include a 2-phase approach to the development of alternatives and the evaluation of the alternatives. So in January, we took a look at the initial 2 alternatives we developed, one for a lower investment, into the system, and one that reflected a higher investment of the system. And our hope was to work with you to evaluate these alternatives and then to get feedback from you in order to develop the 4 additional service alternatives to complete the study. So we did to take a look at the initial, in the next slide, the initial alternatives review. The 2 alternatives, as I said, were largely very similar. 1-seat ride from North Adams to Boston, the same 4 stations, North Adams, Greenfield, Fitchburg, North Station, 5 trains a day at approximately the same times, the same approach for purpose of trips. We assumed that we would accommodate commuter schedules for the MBTA and the existing freight trains. We assumed a 2-minute dwell time at stations using the Amtrak standard, and we would have conventional diesel trains with Amtrak type equipment, and we assumed no modification or investment in MBTA infrastructure. So as you see at the bottom, the level of investment was the main difference in what in the 2 alternatives. So the lower investment alternative was minimum signal improvements, some minimum track improvements at East Deerfield Yard to raise the speed there, and some trackage additions to allow trains to meet and pass each other on this largely single track railroad. On the higher investment, we had a much higher level of track rehabilitation to increase track class, which is to say speed overall in most of that track segment. This would enable us to use the capability of the train equipment to optimize the speed of the trains themselves as they interact with the track. We also made more additions in order to support the ability of the trains to meet and pass each other on a single track railroad. Next, we did an evaluation of the alternatives. What would be the difference what's the difference between these 2 levels of investment? The main difference to focus on right now is the difference in travel times that you see in the middle of the chart here. The lower investment gave us essentially a 4-hour round trip, a 4-hour trip between North Adams and Boston. The higher investment level gave us a trip that was 2 hours and 48 minutes eastbound and just about 3 hours westbound. So a greater than less than 3 hours compared to the 4-hour for the lower investment. This lower trip time leads to a couple of things. It leads to higher ridership, and it leads to higher cost for the investment. So the higher investment obviously is higher cost, which gave us a level of construction jobs that's higher than the lower investment, gives us a level of construction output that's higher than the lower investment alternative. At the same time, the higher ridership yielded by that better trip time gave us more transportation cost savings for a higher number of customers. Under cost effectiveness, the higher cost in the entire investment gives us a higher capital cost per mile than the lower investment one. And because we have such a higher cost, we still have a higher cost per rider. But when you look at the annual operating cost per rider, the annual operating costs are very similar, and the higher ridership gives you a lower continuing cost to operate and maintain the railroad. Finally, we look at environmental impacts such as vehicle miles traveled reductions. Because the higher investment level gives us a greater ridership, that means more vehicles off the road and a higher level of VMT reduction for the higher investment. And both alternatives give us minimized potential impacts because they are within the footprint of the existing right-of-way, and neither one is expected to impact MBTA commuter rail operations. Next, we took your feedback. We listened to what you had to say, both at the workshop and in the follow-up. Many of you communicated with us after the workshop. You asked us to consider additional stops such as Shelburne Falls and Gardner. You asked us to evaluate a connection to Albany. You wanted us to consider seasonal attractors for service out to Western Massachusetts and to consider potential upgrades to support higher speeds. You also had some questions. If we look at the next slide, there were some comments and questions on the ridership projections that we had. And you also had questions about the cost estimation. So now I'm going to turn to my colleague, Paul Nelson, for some of that.
Thanks, Anna. So what I wanted to review with you is basically the 2 procedures that we followed, both for ridership and for cost estimation in the different alternatives, specifically because having this two-step alternatives development process allowed us to further refine each of them between when you last saw us at the public workshop and today's meeting. So what I wanted to review is the ridership procedure and how it's changed, the estimation of ridership and the procedure that we followed. So this diagram here outlines the first process that we used in the initial data that we shared. And that was to develop the model, the ridership estimates based on streetlight data, which is a location-based services resource where you can basically look at origins and destinations from each community to others, and basically applying that to the MBTA ridership, and then using a travel time comparison to translate that to how ridership would function on the longer trips of out to North Adams and Greenfield. So we basically followed that three-step process to get the original numbers that we shared. On this slide, I'll share that we tweaked it slightly. So if you go to the next slide, Sarah, we now have a four-step process. And probably the biggest change that occurred was when looking at travel time, we didn't just look at total travel time of the passenger rail trip, but we actually looked at how it compared to driving, right? So we found that was a better metric in trying to estimate the propensity for people to ride. So just to outline these four steps, we did the same thing up front where we looked at the total number of trips recorded in Streetlight between communities and Boston or other destinations along the route, and translated that to the observed MBTA commuter rail ridership. At the same time, we also looked at how those commuter rail trips compare to the alternate trip via a single occupancy vehicle. And then made it in our second step, we had to make an adjustment to that estimation, basically equation that reflected the less frequent travel of the intercity passenger rail on the northern tier, because the commuter rail runs 20, 30 trips a day, where we were looking at 5 trips per day. So there is some adjustment that needs to be made there. Then in the third step, we applied that comparison of comparable travel and auto and train travel time to the estimated boardings, and that allowed us to end up with the resulting ridership estimates, which we'll share later in the presentation. So we just wanted to make sure we reviewed there that we have refined how we're looking at ridership for the different alternatives. Next slide, please. And just to recall what some of that streetlight data looks like, when we have shared this in earlier presentations, but this is a breakdown of total trips recorded in the corridor when you look at them in segments of west, central, and east as laid out in the maps shown on right. And so you can see that the majority of trips recorded by Streetlight are in the eastern section, and that we have a sense from their time of day and their frequency, how many are non-work trips versus work trips. So this is just to revisit that and show you kind of how trip making looks in the corridor. So we can go on to the next one. The other question we had about it is how the catchment areas for the stations work. And what you can see here is an example of 2 alternatives and how basically the catchment area of communities breaks down between stations. The map on the left shows the northern tier communities in Massachusetts, and you can see that it does overlap into communities in New Hampshire, Vermont, and New York. How they were assigned to each station, where basically the trips recorded in each community, how they were assigned to go to a specific station over another. And you can see with the spacing of the black communities represent the locations of the stations in that alternative. So the first one has North Adams, Greenfield, Fitchburg, and then basically kind of a Cambridge, Boston station. The one on the right shows how those catchment areas then break up differently when you have multiple stations. So this is the catchment areas for the alternative that looks at the most numerous stations. So you've got North Adams, Shelburne Falls, Greenfield, Athol, Gardner, and Fitchburg. And you can see how those break up. And it's all tied to basically the center of the geography of each catchment area to the station. We find the shortest, and that puts it in that catchment area bucket. Next, please. So then to move on to cost estimation. Just to refresh everyone, cost estimation is the process of forecasting the cost of building an infrastructure project, and it factors in things such as materials, location, different area of the country basically, and how accessible it is, the equipment that would be used, and the labor involved. And the big thing to factor in here is, how we estimate the cost really depends on the level of design. At the stage we are, where we're in preliminary planning and feasibility, there's not as much known about the construction locations. We don't have survey of the area. We don't have detailed condition reports of, the track and the bridges. So certain contingencies are added in, which is noted there. So that's one of the things we did. And again, I'll just reiterate that there's, a separate cost estimated for material, equipment, and labor costs for each element of the improvements, and it's all based on recent railroad construction projects in Massachusetts and the surrounding states. And just to see, this is the kind of matrix of things that contribute to the cost estimates when they come together. There's the construction, there's the need to potentially acquire right-of-way, which in this corridor is really a limited number because all of the improvements along the route are within the existing railroad right-of-way, but it did have an impact in the alternatives that considered a new layover facility in North Adams. So there, a certain amount of cost for right-of-way was assumed. We have to show that the civil system contingency is at 0% design. So that's just that contingency of not having the survey, not having the detailed information about how this would actually be done. Then you have the vehicle costs are factored into it. You need new equipment to run the service. And then we also have to represent the impact of inflation, and that's that escalation for future costs. So factoring in, a certain allotment of time for permitting design before it's actually constructed. And then again, there is engineering and permitting work that would have to be done to start construction. Next, please. So again, we refined the estimates, and that factors in looking at, what our assumptions were for the major cost associated with all of these alternatives is taking the rail from the existing condition, which allows a certain speed, and refreshing it, rehabbing it, right? Like replacing some of the ties, some of the ballast, some of the rails, so that trains can operate at higher speeds over it. And that's the key to getting that travel time savings that you see in the first two alternatives that Anna shared. So we refined how that, what kind of assumptions we should make on a grand scale for that. We also included a few things that helped reduce the cost. We added in a credit basically for being able to recycle the rail that was replaced. And we also found with some additional research that our rolling stock estimates the first time through were higher than they probably should be. So we revised them lower. And then we also took a look at some of the more detailed elements of the station platforms and how we would make them accessible. So you have to factor in not only the construction of the platform, but the supporting stairways and ramp systems to make sure that they're accessible for all. Next, please. And then I think I turn it back to you, Anna, right, to go over alternatives. Great.
So thank you, Paul. So we then took the feedback we received from you all and developed 4 additional alternatives for a total of 6. Alternative 3 would be an electrified service with an overhead catenary system and electric rolling stock. Alternative 4 is a full local service with a number of additional stations. Alternative 5 is an extension to Albany. And alternative 6 we're calling the Northern Tier Rail Link, which is a train that travels from North Adams to Greenfield, and then passengers connect at Fitchburg for the MBTA commuter rail service ride into Boston and Cambridge. You'll see in the next several slides the diagram of what these alternatives look like, along with some of the features of these alternatives and the cost the cost for the various types, the cost components of the infrastructure improvements. These alternatives all are similar in several ways. We still have 5 trains a day. We still have, we're basing all of the improvements on these alternatives on the higher level of investment from the phase 1 alternatives. So that higher level investment is the essential platform on which we build these alternatives. And there may be some modifications to that higher level investment, but it assumes that that's being made along with some other modifications. Here in the electrified service, you see we're establishing overhead catenary system, rolling stock that will work with it. You see the cost of track work, bridges, signal grade crossings and signals, stations, layover facility in North Adams, and the rolling stock. The total cost of about $3 billion. You see the additional stations besides North Adams and Greenfield. We have Athol, Fitchburg, Fitchburg was Air, and Porter Square. We've also added Porter Square to all of the alternatives we're showing you today as something that was very popular coming out of the public workshop. The track improvements, besides electrification, are all very similar to the higher level of improvements. Some double track that allows for meeting and passing, increasing class track, and therefore the speed of the track, and still giving us that advantageous trip time. Next, we'll see alternative 4, which is full local service with stations, not just with North Adams, Shelburne Falls, Athol, Gardner, and as well as the ones up at Porter Square. These stations are added to the infrastructure improvements at the higher level that we talked about. As we go through these infrastructure improvements, the sections of double track may change from alternative to alternative because of the difference in scheduling. You need to have that double track in different places, but the essential level of investment is very similar. And here you see we've taken out that we have very similar costs, except stations are more plentiful and therefore more costly. There is no electrification cost. Rolling stock is a little more less costly because electric equipment is more expensive. And the cost comes down approximately 50%, down to about $1.6 billion for a full local service alternative. Next, we'll talk about service to Albany. We extend the service from North Adams through Schenectady and down to Albany. This is using a track that's currently exclusively freight track. For this extension, some costs go up because of the additional track work required in New York. We have gone back to the original station scheme, except we are using Porter Square. We have added Schenectady and Albany as new stations. Existing stations used in New York service. And we have, of course, added Porter Square. So there are some improvements in New York. We note them here, Stillwater and Clifton Park. We have the rest of the improvements are largely the same. We take out the layover facility in North Adams because we will use facilities in Albany. And we now have a new price tag for this one of about $1.9 billion, about $2 billion, less than the electrified, more than the full local service. Next, we'll take a look at the final alternative, the Northern Tier Rail Link. We have assumed the same level of investment. We've included one additional station, Athol, and all trains would stop in Fitchburg as the others did. However, now the customers would alight and wait for a train, for a Fitchburg line train for the trip into Boston. So we assume most of the other costs from the higher level of investment. We're increasing tracks class and speeds. We do also add rehabilitation of a siding in Fitchburg to allow trains to wait for, to come in and wait for the trains to come in from Boston. So you see, we still have track work, bridges, the same signals and grade crossings, no electrification cost here. a little more than the original scheme for stations. And we go back to that North Adams layover, and rolling stock is essentially the same. So now we have a cost again of about $1.6 billion for the cost of these improvements. Next, we tried to provide some context for these costs. We looked at the total project costs per route mile for each of the alternatives. And for the alternatives, most of them are between Boston and North Adams. So we give you $6 million per route mile for the lower investment alternative in phase A, 11 million, as you see, for this higher level of investment in the phase A alternatives. Alternative 3, as you saw in the earlier slides, is the most expensive, and the per mile cost there is almost 21 million. The others that you can see, 11 million for full local service, 9 million for the Albany extension, and 11 million for the Northern Tier Rail Link. We compared these to a couple of regional projects to give you some context there. The Hartford line provided improvements for intercity service between New Haven and Springfield, Massachusetts. The per mile cost there were $19 million. And South Coast Rail, which is finishing up now in the southeastern Massachusetts, into Bedford and Fall River, is a commuter rail project. The per mile costs there were about $13 million. So now I'll turn you over to Paul, who'll talk about some of the ways we further evaluated these.
Sure, thanks, Anna. And I'll fully review this. I know there's a lot of information to share on this table, but what we wanted to do was provide a single location to be able to compare all 6 alternatives to each other. So what you can see is a lot of this information was already conveyed in how Anna described the different alternatives, but the first 2 rows show the frequency and the stations that are served by each of the alternatives. And you can see that we're maintaining 5 trains per day across the board. You can see that the second set, the latter 4 alternatives, have the added stations looking at Athol, Ayer, Porter Square, Gardner, Shelburne Falls, some of the New York stations. And then, not to be forgotten, but alternative 6 includes the connection to all the MBTA commuter rail stations from Fitchburg into Boston. Now, how that translates into travel times, which, if you recall from the ridership overview, is a big factor in how ridership, what our ridership numbers look like. You can see here that we're just comparing the eastbound travel times to simplify the comparison. And so I'll start with the North Adams to Boston, but the lower investment, like Anna said before, is almost a 4-hour trip, and that can be decreased down to close, within 3 hours in the higher investment of alternative 2. And then you'll see that actually alternatives 3, 4, and 5 kind of shake out to be a similar travel time. And that's just because there's an interplay between the number of passengers and the equipment. So, but the electrified service, those trains do have a more optimal acceleration curve and things like that. But how that factors into the real conditions on the line is why it ends up being relatively similar to some of the others. But one thing you should note is in alternative 6, because this rail link service requires a transfer from the Northern Tier service to the MBTA commuter rail, your trip into Boston ends up being relatively long, not only because of the transfer time, but because the MBTA service into Boston has more stops and therefore slower than the Northern Tier service. And you have a pretty similar profile to the travel times in the Greenfield to Boston, but we just wanted to highlight how that differs from North Adams. So you can see that those travel times hover between 2 hours and 2 minutes, 2 hours and 0 minutes, up to 2.5 hours. And you can see that across the remaining elements listed here, the maximum speeds are still the same across all of them. And just to make sure you're clear, maximum speeds are what's allowable. It's not necessarily what can be attained by the equipment. So it's more kind of a speed limit than the actual speed that's being traveled. For all 4 alternatives, because really no new alignment is included, we consider these environmental impacts relatively minimal. as far as the built environment, because you'd be staying within the right of way. So you wouldn't be impacting anything that hasn't been disturbed. Passenger rail impacts, all of these were able, the Fitchburg MBTA service runs on an hourly service. And so all of the scheduled Northern Tier service was slotted basically halfway between each train. So you're really not disrupting passenger rail. And then freight rail impacts, that the trains that we could identify run by the freight operators, we scheduled things to avoid it. And with the 5 daily trains, there was enough windows to really minimize the impact there. And that's another element that factored into where the sidings were placed, so that we could help avoid that. And then you can see here that just thinking of other potential community-based impacts, there are grade crossings on the corridor. And you can see there's 69 crossings in all the alternatives except alternative 5. And that's because there's just so much more route mileage going out to New York where you trigger the additional crossings. All right, move on to the next one, please. And so it's important to understand how the alternatives within the Northern Tier service compare to each other, but we also wanted to provide some context of how these preliminary concepts for the Northern Tier are comparing to other existing service. So there are 4 services laid out here for comparison. The first one, after the Northern Tier, which is the first column, you have the Pere Marquette, which is a service that runs between Chicago, Illinois, and Grand Rapids, Michigan. You also have the Piedmont service in North Carolina, which is Charlotte to Raleigh. You have the Downeaster, which runs from Brunswick, Maine to Boston, Massachusetts. And then you have the Vermonter, which is a service that runs basically from St. Albans, Vermont, which is north of Burlington, down to New Haven, Connecticut, where it links up with the Northeast Corridor and actually runs all the way through to DC. And so you can see that, especially if you look at the distance of each service, we were trying to find services that were similar in length, Vermonter being the biggest departure from that. And you can see the population served, just not just trying to understand how big everything, I guess the total market really is. And so Northern Tier has a market served about 6.7 million people, which is comparable to the Pere Marquette and larger than the Piedmont and Downeaster, but not as large as the Vermonter, because that's a catchment area that grabs onto the longer route and the population centers of like New York and Philadelphia and things like that. And then how that compares what the estimated ridership is and what they're seeing on those services. So you can see that, the Downeaster here really shines as a relatively popular service for the size of the population served and the length. But you can see that other services don't necessarily have that same amount, but they still have in the realm of 100,000 trips per year. Going to the next one. So I guess the idea is looking at these different alternatives and their comparisons to existing services. Some of the things we wanted to distill down to the group, all of these alternatives would bring a benefit in added connectivity, added mobility options, and give people a choice from their vehicles if they own them. And if they don't have, and basically it brings mobility to those that don't own vehicles. From the previous presentations, I'll just remind you that, the transit service exists in the corridor, but to actually travel along the corridor, you have a few gaps in service which lack connectivity, or you have to just rely on connections between RTA buses to do that. All the alternatives would provide positive environmental and economic impacts. There's, definitely benefits in taking cars off the road, and rail service and train station development has demonstrated benefits to the areas around them. I guess in looking at the 6 alternatives, alternative 3 and alternative 4 generate the highest ridership levels. And I think that's a function of both have really some of the lowest travel times amongst the alternatives, and they also tend to have the most stations. So I think that's one other takeaway, is that it's not like it seems from our estimation that the more stations you have, the more likely you are to grow ridership. So that's a positive indication for some of the folks that we're looking for more stations beyond just the Greenfield and North Adams stations. And because you get higher ridership, you see a follow-on benefit in transportation cost savings and reduction of VMT within the Route 2 corridor. Next, please. So I think, Michaela, let's go back to you.
Yes, it does. Thanks,
Okay.
Paul. So at this time, we would like to open it up to the working group for discussion. And this next slide just kind of summarizes the proposed service alternatives as Paul presented a bit earlier. And in addition to kind of this summary, and again, reiterating what Paul said, that we understand that it's a lot of information and this information will be made available following today's meeting for additional review. But our next slide also shows a couple of questions that we have as well. In addition to any sort of general comments or questions from the working group about the alternatives evaluation, we'd also like to get your input on what are some of the next steps that you might recommend. Do any of the alternatives, the proposed alternatives presented, kind of best address the study's goals and objectives? And are there any additional items that could be further examined? So at this point, if there are any working group members who would like to share any comments or questions at this time, feel free to raise your virtual hand and you will have the ability to unmute yourself. I see a raised hand from Senator Comerford.
Thank you so much, Michaela, and thank you to the study team for this excellent work. I know we've been, hoping for it, and so seeing it here in such a full and thorough way is inspiring and heartening and pretty thrilling. I want to underscore just the excitement that I'm feeling about the local stops. I'm also feeling great excitement about no transferring. So a straight shot from Western Massachusetts right into Porter Square and South Station. I feel like that's a game changer for us. I also have to say that I really appreciate the combination of climate, climate readiness. So all electric trains, making their way along the northern tier as a sister effort to the southern tier. Feels also very good. I also just want to say that the price differentials are notable for me, and what you've presented really does feel quite doable for the Commonwealth and would be for the northern tier a game changer in 3 counties, right? Berkshire, Franklin, Worcester, total game changer. So I want to leave room for many other questions. I have lots more to say, but I'm very excited, very heartened, and I want to, at some point talk about next steps, how the administration is thinking about this feasibility, timeline, how we can best support the thinking here as we continue to refine it with people's good feedback. And forgive me if you said this, but I know that there is a public meeting next week. And so it'll be important for all of us on the commission to be able to let our folks know about the opportunity for them to hear exactly what we just heard, or perhaps even more, because I do think building that kind of public awareness will be important. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator. We appreciate you being with us today. The next see a raised hand from Representative Barrett.
Yes, I may be floating in and out because the byways of Western Mass, the cell service a little weak here. But just to echo the comments of Senator Comerford, also, but I was wondering, when you put into the cost proposals, some of the stations, such in North Adams that's planned, what is the cost of that station or loading area?
Anna and Paul.
I think the order of magnitude was around $5 or $6 million.
Okay.
The
Is it
layover station. The layover station was more. Are you asking about the layover facility or
Yeah,
different stations?
I'm looking at the cheapest alternative there as a way of cutting the expense of some of this, but at least from the North Adams area. The need for the more expensive one, I question a little bit, but I certainly want to. I'll take a Quonset hut right about now if we can get the rail service in. But,
Well, in North Adams, you have the state passenger station You also have the layover, which is the parking lot for the trains where they're cleaned and serviced at night. So we were talking about passenger stations. Okay, look, that number.
Okay, and what is it? And that number was around 5 or 6 million, you said?
Yeah, and that's primarily to develop the accessible boarding conditions for, you know, a platform that's high level to allow for level boarding for persons with mobility devices. So there's certainly probably, you know, there's certainly ways to look at budgets for things like this, but that was the main driver of a lot of that
Okay.
cost. So,
All right. And the complete cost, just on the, because I don't have it in front of me, I'll see it later. Is from North Adams right into Boston, the higher price that you had there that would reduce the time.
well, the alternatives go from about 1.5 billion, and the highest one is the electrification at about 3 billion,
Okay,
with some
without-
with variations in between.
okay, so that's with electrification, correct?
Electrification is expensive to build. Yep.
Okay. And what would the cost be without it? Not that I'm pushing it, I'm just curious.
Without it, I think the numbers were between 1.5 and 1.8 billion, 1.9 billion, depending on the number of stations and some of the variations in track work.
Okay, that's my question now. We'll be talking next week a little bit too, but thank you very much. You've done a great job on this, and like Senator Comerford, this is a game changer, and it's a relatively small investment for state government to be making. And in dollars and cents, it's actually less than what they invested back in 1850 for the construction of the Hoosick Tunnel, which opened up the west and the east. So I'm very happy with it, and good job. We'll be talking next week, I'm sure.
Thank you so much, Representative. We appreciate your feedback and your input. I next see a raised hand from Robert Malnati.
Hi, thank you. I was looking at the ridership estimate, and it was at the far end of, was it 3,400 up to 300,000 riders annually? Can you expound on that?
Yes, so what was captured there was the range of ridership estimated for all the alternatives. And I can tell you that it was alternative 3 and alternative 4 that were at the high end. And the 3,400 is really low. That actually applies to alternative 6. It had the lowest ridership, primarily because the methods we're using to estimate ridership are very travel time dependent. So as you extend the time that the trip takes, such as the transfer and the use of the MBTA service, that's where it really impacted the estimated ridership.
Okay, and as a follow-up to that, did you take into consideration the current Lakeshore Limited that's used every day from, Albany to Boston?
Yeah, that was actually our reference for trying to estimate it, looking at the Lakeshore Limited ridership and how the comparison between the travel time and driving time for those stations compares to the ridership they see. And another thing I neglected to mention is that we did we used actually the Downeaster service as a proxy for trips that would be taken within the corridor that aren't Boston based. So looking at trips between Greenfield and intermediate stations like the ones that include Athol or North Adams, things like that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any additional comments or questions from the working group? And again, also in addition to any comments or questions related to the alternatives, we'd also like to get your input on any kind of next steps that you might recommend related to maybe any of these alternatives that might best address the goals and objectives of the study, and if there are any additional elements that could be looked at. I next see a raised hand from Linda.
Thanks, Michaela. Paul, I wonder to that last question, if before the public meeting to whatever it was, 300,000+, I wonder if there is a way to put a notation there to explain that low number is because of alternative 6. Because when you look at alternatives 3 and 4, which for me are most promising, ridership is very competitive with the lines that you've compared to.
I can make sure that that's mentioned specifically. Maybe we can kind of indicate in the range that's provided, what the low number associates. Maybe we can maybe what we can do is provide an estimate of the low and then an estimate of the highest for the best and worst performing ridership or something like that, so people understand how those numbers actually relate to each other.
Thanks, Paul. I think that'd be super helpful.
Okay.
Great, thank you. Are there any other additional comments or questions from the working group? Representative Blais.
Thank you. And thanks for putting us all on the screen. It's helpful now for me to know who's in the room. It's a little hard to tell before, so it's good to see you all. I have so many questions. First, I want to say that the ridership numbers and cost estimates here are really incredible and way better than I ever could have dreamed. So I just want to thank you all for doing such a great job in terms of analyzing all of this. I hope it's okay. I'm going to ask a lot of questions. I'm going to take a little bit of our time and hope that this line of questioning will be helpful. For the cost estimates, Paul, that you talked about when you were talking about building out the line, were the cost estimates based on contracting out to a private entity, or are the cost estimates based on using the railroad to do the work, or are those similar?
Anna, you're going to have to help me with that one.
They're based on some recent rail construction projects, which are probably a combination of those things. So we did not drill down to that level of detail, but often the railroad will use its own forces if they have them. I can't really tell you right now if CSX would have sufficient, or Norfolk Southern, because they're both owners, would have sufficient forces up here. So we did not go down to that level of detail. We used comparable projects for those numbers.
Okay, you also mentioned new vehicles and rolling stock in the cost estimates. Okay, so I'm wondering, so who owns in your estimations there, if we're talking about new vehicles and rolling stock, whose stock are we talking about? Are we talking about Amtrak? Are we talking about purchasing new vehicles? How are those cost estimates developed around vehicles?
The cost estimates include the capital cost of purchasing equipment, which is one way to do it. So the assumption here is that Amtrak would be the operator. But the Commonwealth, as the sponsor of this service, would always be responsible for the various capital costs. And with Amtrak state-supported services, often that is, Amtrak might supply the rolling stock, but you would pay a fee that's devised in a formula for that rolling stock. So you pay one way or the other. But in order to look at the true capital cost of the project, we treated it as if the Commonwealth was buying the equipment. Which is a possibility if what the Commonwealth decides it wants something special, it can do it. But they would have to pay Amtrak for that equipment, either through an annual fee or some other arrangement.
I would add here that I think the cost is based on the current Amtrak procurement for quarter trains.
That's right.
So is the assumption here, even in the local service, that this is intercity rail service, not commuter?
That's right.
Okay.
It would be basically intercity rolling stock, so there's a little bit of a price premium associated with that versus commuter equipment.
Yeah, the assumption of the study is that it's an intercity service. And even though it's serving some local communities, in the railroad practice, it comes under the FRA, and it's the Commonwealth be looking likely for federal railroad money and those types of grant programs, so which brings it into the intercity category, even though it is serving some local communities.
That's really helpful to know. For the station estimates, there were several that talked about accessible features with platforms. On the Vermonter, we ended up phasing several of the high-level platforms. Is that so the cost estimates that you included are full construction of high-level platforms.
Correct, yep.
Could they be phased, and would that help to possibly
And it did
lower the cost?
level platforms, because this is an active freight railroad. I thought we were using mini highs.
No, we went for the full high and assumed a retractable platform edge. But we just wanted to put out there the full cost of accessibility, recognizing that phasing is possible. That you can if you can get permission to do mini high platforms. But we felt the responsible thing was to show the full cost of full accessibility.
I appreciate that, and certainly wanting to understand the full cost. It might be helpful to understand what the cost of a mini high would be, and then phasing in the full high level platform as we're looking at implementing the service, and really truly understanding what the cost estimates could be. I'm assuming that if we're looking at electrification of the line, east of Fitchburg is already electrified.
Yeah, we assumed that would have happened by then. So
By then, by then when? What year are we looking at, Anna?
well, when would the Commonwealth have the
You have to,
wherewithal?
yeah, you have to have there's got to be like a 5-year, 10-year, 15-year. If we're talking about by then, there has to be an estimate there about what you were thinking about.
Well, we used construction estimates in this decade, but that doesn't really relate necessarily to when the Commonwealth would actually fund and build a project like this. So we had to pin something down for purposes of cost estimating. However, electrification is a pretty big endeavor, and the MBTA only has limited electrification itself. Whether that's the first phase of the Northern Tier service is a good question, but we didn't feel it was appropriate to burden this project with the cost of electrifying MBTA project electrification.
Okay, so it's not currently electrified. It could be the first phase of the project if we were looking at electrification.
If you were looking at if the Commonwealth had all the money to build an electric railroad, they could obviously do it. But being a very high, we didn't assume it would necessarily happen right away. We will be looking at possible schedules as we finish the project, but we just didn't feel it was appropriate to give this project the responsibility for funding electrification east of Fitchburg. And in fact, you could have an electric railroad west of Fitchburg with rolling stock or other that would either be dual mode or and take the trains all the way into Boston without an electric. They could be battery. Well, batteries new, but there are different ways of having dual mode equipment that would allow you to make a trip under the wire, and then the rest of the trip not under the wire.
Gotcha. And you meant so it's ownership is CSX. Pan Am Southern along the line.
Well, the Pan Am Southern is the owner, and the co-equal owners of Pan Am Southern are Norfolk Southern and CSX.
And they'd all have to grant us ridership. Rail rights.
Yeah, they would have to, there's a negotiation with an owner, with a landlord railroad that has to take place. And we didn't assume, we assumed kind of average access fees here, within the O&M operating and maintenance costs, but it's all subject to negotiation with the owners, what you're able to do.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't assume the worst, we didn't assume nothing, so.
And looking at the maps, there was track reconfiguration west of Shelburne Falls on all of the plans. It seemed like, what is that?
You have to build a certain amount of double tracking to allow the various freight and passenger trains to pass each other. So the railroad is largely single track now. So as you add trains to a single track railroad, you have to provide additional tracks so that instead of that they can pass each other.
So it looks like there's two. If you're looking west, like in between Shelburne Falls and Charlemont, it looks like that's the double tracking that would need to happen.
That's at least part of it. I don't have it in my head, but yeah, it sounds right. So
okay, it just looked like it was farther away. It looked like a little bit of a loop rather than just straight double tracking.
the nature of the topography, I imagine, but it's
Right.
it's double tracking for some distance that's necessary to accommodate the schedule.
And Anna, I'll just add that we were assuming since this railroad was historically a 2-track railroad, that you'd be able to add that double track within the existing right of way.
That's right.
That is in the existing right of way?
Yes.
Okay. And how many freight trains are going on the line currently back and forth?
I'm trying to think, I think it was about 40 a week, something like that,
It's
but
about 6 a day.
Yeah.
3 in each direction.
in different types of trains.
The eastern leg is the volumes on the eastern leg between Fitchburg and Greenfield are not the same as they are west of Greenfield.
Okay. And just 2 more questions. I'm so sorry to take up so much time, and imagine I'm
No,
hoping
it's
you're
all right.
at the
That's
slide
fine.
deck so that we can.
That's why
take
we're
it.
here.
I appreciated the question about the ridership numbers. That also was like, how the heck do we have a ridership projection delta of 3,900 and 304 something thousand? It would be helpful in the alternative slides to note the ridership numbers there. I was trying to take screen grabs as we were going along, but I don't think that the ridership projections are on those slides. So it might be helpful for people as they're going through to see that, as well as it being noted on that one slide where it notes those big numbers. And then I was wondering if there was a conversation about, there's sort of the straight ridership from North Adams to Boston with limited stops along the way. And then there's the one where you get to Fitchburg and then you switch over to the MBTA. I'm wondering if you tried some sort of mix where you did some straight throughs and some with the connections to the MBTA, because we always think west to east, but I'm thinking about east to west in terms of induced economic development, and we could capture people from those MBTA service stations who want to go west and do some trips where we were connecting to the MBTA out of those 5 trains, and then some where we were doing the straight shots through. I'm wondering if that was an alternative that you considered.
We did not consider that mix for this study. We took the 5 trips a day and had them all meet, which would allow for people coming into Fitchburg to travel west on those 5 trains, but we didn't consider a mix of some through trains and some making that local connection.
Okay. And then my final question, induced economic development, are we talking about that? Is that part of this anywhere?
Yeah, that is something that we've been working on and we would hopefully present in a future meeting. So,
And how many meetings are left?
We have one additional round of meetings, and I think as part of Paul's presentation, talked a little bit about some of that that economic development piece. Paul, could you kind of expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, so we have assessments of like the jobs created and the economic like value added from the capital construction cost. I'll add that the BCA, which is being finalized, the benefit cost analysis for the alternatives, does include other economic benefits, such as increase in real estate values and things like that. So
We're all interested in understanding that, not just the construction costs, but also the induced economic development.
Right. And honestly, the benefits of the capital spending are kind of fall in line with everything else, right? The more expensive a construction project is, the more benefits it has to the community and the more jobs it results in. So that's all well and good, but it's not really a differentiator between the different alternatives as much as some of the other aspects, I would say.
Thank you. I really appreciate you answering. Sorry for so many questions. To the extent that we can tweak those slides around with the ridership estimates, if there's anything that can be discussed in terms of phasing projects in terms of the cost and the timeline for stations and double tracking anything along those lines, I think it would just help us to better plan going forward in terms of what our strategy is in terms of looking at funding streams. So thank you. Thank you for letting me talk so much.
Thank you so much for sharing all of those questions. I appreciate that. Senator Comerford.
I'm sorry, I'm in a very loud place, so you'll forgive me. So I agree. Thank you, Rep. Lay, for those great questions. I had a question about whether or not the study team has considered a relationship or how we would relate to Keolis. And the line from Fitchburg on, what impact are you thinking it would have with Keolis? I have a couple of other questions as well. I'm sorry, Anna, you're mute.
I thought I clicked. Yeah, we developed the alternatives to avoid affecting the MBTA commuter rail trains that are operated by Keolis. So we, because they have a clock face hourly schedule, we were able to schedule Northern Tier trains between their inbound and outbound trains pretty comfortably. And we also, at the same time, avoided freight trains. So, you know, in the development of a service in a detailed level, of course, Mass DOT would have to coordinate with the MBTA in the same way they'd be working with the freight owners on the other side. But in my own experience of running that system for 8 years, the MBTA and Mass DOT generally do work together pretty well. So that's about, we didn't do any further detailed planning except for the schedule coordination.
No, that's really helpful. And just for our own awareness, you know, for this group's awareness, I mean, that could be yet one more added benefit, right? Is being able, once we get further east, there are even more trains that we could, you know, to which we could connect rather than just going all the way into Porter Square and South Station. So for the public meeting, so there's two more buckets of questions. For the public meeting, I'm hoping that the alternatives can look at rough timeline of implementation. I didn't have as smart a question as Rep. Lay in terms of how we might phase it in, but any kind of texture that we could get to, you know, to offer the public about how long this could take, I think would be useful. Because it does seem, you know, it does seem to have a pretty finite implementation, given the fact that the tracks are down. So that would be fun to see, I think. And then also, I just want to pull out Rep. Lay's interest in a narrative for the public meeting on economic development potential, also climate potential. You know, the intersection, to the extent that the study committee is, study group is looking at that, and I know you are to some extent, you know, how could we talk to the public about that and an investment? You know, so how many cars could come off the road? You know, what's the carbon emission potential differential as a result of trains? Things like that. I do think it's one of the things we said was interesting to us, in addition, especially to economic potential. And when we think about the economic potential, it would be good to have that conversation about the economic potential, not only for Western Mass, but also for Eastern Mass. I mean, I think we know, right? The traffic in Eastern Mass is so bad. The housing crisis is worse than anywhere else in the Commonwealth. Like, so if there's any kind of hypotheses that you've been brewing on that we could bring forward to help really characterize the real positive, like sort of all lift all boats kind of opportunity that this project represents. You know, again, it may not all be possible for next week, but it would be good to weave in those threads. And I appreciate this. And the last thing, so the last bucket is, let's talk about outreach if we could for the next meeting. And I know your plate is more than full, Michaela, but I'm wondering if we're going to get potentially like any kind of language that we can share with municipalities and stakeholders. You know, it does feel like this is a pretty consequential meeting next week, and we've been doing our best to get the word out, but it would be great to know what MassDOT is thinking in terms of generating it, and if there'll be any collateral that we can use and share, because this is excellent work, you know, and it would be good to get it in front of as many people as possible.
Most definitely. Thank you, Senator. To your first two comments related to kind of implementation timeline and showing some of the economic benefits, those are part of our next steps. So kind of to preview a little bit of later on in this presentation as part of the next task that we'll be conducting, we will be working on developing kind of recommended next steps for the project. And that will include implementation steps, funding opportunities, and timelines of that nature. Related to outreach, yes, we are having a public meeting next week, next Thursday at 6 o'clock, to present all of this phase 2 alternatives development and analysis information. We have, if anyone on the call is not registered already, the registration information is available on the study website. And there's also a flyer as well. So if anyone would like to share that flyer with all of their networks, that flyer is available. I believe there's also been social media postings as well related to some of these meetings as well. So definitely getting the word out. So we appreciate everyone's kind of collaboration and coordination with throughout this process in getting the word out and helping us and coordinating with us on a lot of these next steps. We appreciate that.
Thank you for pointing us to those, Michaela. Very grateful.
Thank you. And are there any additional comments or questions from the working group at this time? Yes, Representative Barrett.
Yes, how long will when do you figure you'll have this presentation available for viewing by the public and so on and so forth?
Once this presentation is made accessible, we'll be able to get it posted on the study website. We're anticipating in advance of next week's meeting, so everyone has a chance to take a look at the information and review it in advance of next week's public meeting.
All right, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Michaela, are you sending the presentation that was given to us today, to the working group? That would be really helpful for us to be able to take a deeper look.
Most definitely. I think we actually are pretty close in terms of the accessibility. So we'll certainly expedite that process in making sure to allow, as you mentioned, having enough time to kind of review the materials in advance of next week.
Thanks so much.
Are there any additional comments or questions from the working group at this time before we transition to comments and questions from the public? Hearing none, I think we can now move to our next slides and talk a little bit about opening it up to members of the public in attendance. So if you'd like to share any comments or questions in writing, please continue to use the Q&A. And if you'd like to share a comment or question verbally, please use the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. Or if you're joining us by phone this evening or this afternoon rather, please dial *9 and that will raise your virtual hand. And we ask that you please share only one comment or question at a time and limit comments to 2 minutes to allow others time to participate. And we'd like to hear from as many people about your thoughts on the content that's been presented today. And we'd like to hear from as many people as we can ahead of today's meeting's end at 2:30. And so as a reminder, this certainly is not the only opportunity to share comments or questions with the study team. Those can be shared throughout the duration of the study process using the comment form on the study website. And so I'd first like to begin with any comments from any elected officials or members of the staff in attendance. Please raise your virtual hand and we can unmute you. And seeing none, I know there are a couple of, or there are quite a few comments in the Q&A, and I also see a raised hand. Oh, I saw a raised hand from Barbara, I believe. Barbara, you should have a notification on your screen to unmute.
Yes, so maybe this is something that could be done before the public meeting. It gets at Representative Blythe and Senator Comerford's issue, I think. The options that have been offered could perhaps be ranked or perhaps could be addressed. Which ones could expand or be segueing into each other? In other words, what are the simplest and cheapest options that could then be added on to? In other words, we have this issue that it takes too long to get anything built. in our society today. And so are there cheap options that then could be done quickly that, and then there's more elaborate ones in your list? Could they be ranked in that way and get started quicker? Can the presentation be organized in that way, and can that be addressed? Can you bring the timeline into the discussion explicitly in that way?
Yes, thank you, Barbara. As we talked a little bit about in terms of kind of next steps for this process, implementation timelines is going to be certainly a factor. And so we can certainly at that time talk about how each of the alternatives kind of compare to each other in that way, so everyone can get a sense of how the alternatives compare in alignment with some of the evaluation criteria that we have developed for this study. So thank you for that comment. We appreciate it. I next see a couple of comments rather in the Q&A related to stations. So there's a comment in the Q&A related from Sean, who says, hopefully I'm interpreting the maps correctly, and Athol would indeed have a station and service as part of this effort. It's the second largest population between Gardner and North Adams after Greenfield. So yes, there are alternatives that include Athol as a station. And Eric also echoes this about Athol and says, not sure if this is the venue or where the official public comment may be submitted through, but as the Athol planning director and with input from the Athol town manager, we 100% support the idea of Athol having a stop on the extension of train service west to North Adams. Athol is the second largest population center between Gardner and North Adams. So thank you, Eric, for being here today, and thank you all for being here today and sharing your comments and questions with us, and for your support of that alternative and that station stop. So I next see a raised hand from Richard. You should have a notification on your screen to unmute.
Yeah, this is Richard Rudolph with the Rail Users Network. I recently moved from Portland, Maine to Hadley, Northampton area. And I have a couple of questions, one of which I think Senator Comfort addressed. That is, there's really a need to know the possible timeline for each of these different alternatives that you have described here today. The other comment I would just make is that the alternative of just dumping people off in Fitchburg and then having people get on the MBTA to North Station, I think is probably a waste of time. And that's because I think you would lose lots of riders. If they have to wait for an MBTA train, that's certainly going to impact total ridership. So I think I understand that might save some money, but ultimately the whole idea behind this project is to get as many people on trains as possible, not only because people need that kind of an option, given age, and lots of young people don't want to drive cars, but it's also because it really would add additional time to the whole project, in terms of building and also in terms of the travel time as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for your comments. Anna and Paul, did you have anything to add to that?
No, actually, Richard observed correctly, as we did, that we didn't want to look at that alternative because we can't assume the outcome. But what it did show is the added time of making that connection severely reduced the ridership and made it the lowest ridership alternative. But in a planning study, you want to look at the array of alternatives, because someone might think that was a good first phase. But in any case, you're absolutely correct on the ridership on that. And as you mentioned, we'll be developing timelines before the end of the project.
I see a couple of comments from Faye in the Q&A. One that talks a little bit about some of the travel times from Athol to North Station. And Faye had a question about If there's no station in Athol, do you think that people who live in Athol would be willing to spend 58 minutes to an hour and 23 minutes to travel to a Greenfield station in order to travel to Boston? So we talked a little bit about some traveler kind of behavior and kind of how stations affect some of the ridership numbers. So Anna and Paul, can you kind of speak a little bit more to that?
I'm happy to do that. I do think that one of the things we did want to learn from testing, adding the stations, was how it would impact ridership and whether it would be kind of a similar bucket of riders just reshuffled to different stations. But I think that the results did show that, you know, the more stations do add ridership for that. And as far as my speculation on if somebody would be willing to do that, which I think is how the question was asked, I doubt anyone would be interested in doing that. So I do think that, you know, looking at the mobility benefits of the different alternatives, you can see the, in measuring the mobility benefits, you can see the benefit of having more stations and making sure there's a convenient option for people in the corridor to ride the service.
And Faye also had another comment rather related to kind of student populations along the corridor and their use of the service, and says, since many of the students I work with do not have access to some resources, Faye is concerned that barriers to transportation would limit their potential that travel brings. And this also extends to other people who rely on public transportation. And Faye, that definitely connects to the actual goals and objectives of this study, is related to transportation equity, having additional mobility choice and options. So thank you for highlighting that. We appreciate your comments, and we appreciate all the comments and questions that we've received today as well. We have a question in the Q&A from Trevor, who asks, what is meant by full local service? So Anna, I believe that was part of your presentation. Can you talk a little bit about what's included in the full local service?
Yeah, that was the alternative where we had the highest number of stations in the for the among the various alternatives. So what we called full local service included, of course, North Adams and Greenfield, but also Shelburne Falls, Athol, Gardner. We added Porter Square to all of the stations as a major destination, of course, but for the local stations, you end up with North Adams, Shelburne Falls, Greenfield, Athol, Gardner, and that's as well as Fitchburg, and that's the highest number of local stops for any of the alternatives we had. And that's the difference between it and the other alternatives.
Thank you, and thank you for the question, Trevor. We appreciate it. I see a raised hand from working group member Linda.
Thanks, Michaela. Paul and Anna, I should know this, but I can't remember. You tweaked the ridership methodology and the cost estimate methodology when you looked at alternatives 3 through 6, but I don't know if you re-looked at alternatives 1 and 2. And did those cost estimates and ridership numbers change from our last meeting?
They did change.
Yes, they did.
Yeah.
We reevaluated 1 and 2 with these new methods. And I would say, I think the biggest factor in the cost was the change in equipment. There was a pretty big change in the cost of equipment. So I think on the whole, that meant that those values went down, but I'll need to confirm that. And ridership went up.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I next see a comment from Paula in the Q&A, who says, thank you all. Thank you for all your tremendous work on this project. I'm interested in learning more about the potential for phasing, as has been mentioned. So yes, thank you, Paula. We appreciate that. Some implementation plan information will be included as part of some of the next steps of this study. So that will be something for the next task of this process. And I next see a question from Jared in the Q&A, who asks, to what extent were transfers in Greenfield from north-south rail a factor in ridership estimates? Were riders transferring from north-south lines a significant source of estimated riders or relatively small?
I can start an answer to that, and I'll ask Andreas to fill in if I missed anything. But the way I'll kind of set the table before I answer this question is, this model that we developed is really the first look at ridership potential in the area. And just like your cost estimates kind of grow in complexity and level of detail, the same thing can occur with the ridership estimates. And I'm adding all that because the only source of information for ridership was the underlying origins and destination data that we got from Streetlight. So it's a relatively straightforward model in that way. So it doesn't count on transfers by rail of any passengers outside those catchment areas. So you probably would be catching some of those. I know that the north-south connection at Greenfield includes some of the Pioneer Valley that does have stations along that route, so you would capture some of those. I think another thing that would have to factor into that is how many of those north-south, thinking of the two parallel routes between western part of the state and Boston, we would have to factor in how likely the transfers would have to be either at Greenfield or they could occur at Springfield too, if they were looking at the west-east alternatives there. So we did not include that at this phase, but that is something to look into and potentially a recommended next step. Andreas, did I capture that okay?
Yeah, you did, and definitely this is an issue that the focus of the study really was looking at Eastern Massachusetts to the Route 2 corridor and not really looking at other markets, and that's certainly something that you'd want to look at in a more detailed effort. So, for example, the big gap here is you're really not treating the New York market at all, New York City market, which of course is the primary travel market in Western Mass is from New York City Metro. And the long distance travel market is New York City Metro into Berkshire County.
Great, thank you. And thank you for that question. And again, thank you all for sharing all of your comments and questions and insights and feedback with us. We appreciate that. You taking the time out of your afternoon to be with us and continuing to work with us as part of this study process. We appreciate that. Are there any additional comments or questions from members of the public at this time? Please continue to type any comments or questions into the Q&A. If you would like to share a comment or question verbally, you may use the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. And if you're joining us by phone this evening, you can dial *9 to raise your virtual hand. So we'll give it a few moments in case anyone's kind of reaching for the raise hand button. All right, seeing no hands raised. Oh, but I see a comment in the Q&A from Artie, who says, given existing track already exists from North Adams to Albany via Schenectady, it seems like a missed opportunity to not proceed with alternative 5. Connectivity ought to be prioritized and maximized, especially considering pre-existing infrastructure. Given the increasingly dire threat of climate change, I don't think we should settle for anything less than full electrification. So thank you, Artie, for sharing that comment. We appreciate it. And as Anna had mentioned a little bit earlier, we look to propose a range of alternatives to get a sense of what some of those evaluation criteria look like, and to be able to compare each of the alternatives to one another and to other service alternatives. But thank you for sharing your feedback related to alternative 5. We appreciate that. And I also see a question in the Q&A from Barbara, who asks, was the unreliability of schedule of the Lakeshore Limited reflected in ridership estimates based on that traffic? Paul, can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. As far as I know, it was just based on the scheduled timetable for the service, and just like Northern Tier, it's on our estimated travel times there. Andreas, is that true?
Yeah, I want to add a comment here about the Lakeshore Limited versus the service. I know we were asked to compare it, but the Lakeshore Limited is that service is a very different critter from a regional service like you would have between North Adams and Boston. It serves the Lakeshore Limit, serves on the order of 21 markets. It serves a couple of the largest metros in the Northeast and Midwest. It's a very, the ridership characteristics are going to be very different from what you have here. So I would not draw a lot of conclusions about how a North Adams Boston service would perform vis-a-vis what the Lakeshore Limited does.
Andre, is related to the reliability.
And yeah, as it related to reliability, we didn't really take. We certainly talked about it. We did not, from an analytical standpoint, we did not take that into account.
Right.
Thank you, Barbara, for that question. I know we have about 5 minutes remaining, and we'd like to kind of transition at this point to talk a little bit about some next steps for the study. And so in terms of some of these next steps, and again, thank you all for your input this afternoon. We appreciate you taking the time again to be with us. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, based on the feedback received, we'll continue to make refinements and we'll develop next recommended next steps for this effort. And in terms of schedule, there is a public meeting that will be held next week to present this phase 2 service alternatives development and analysis and garner additional feedback. And we anticipate holding the next working group and public meetings this winter to share additional information and receive feedback on task 7, the development of recommended next steps. And so I see one last question from Leo, who asks, how was the analysis of seasonal draws reflected? So Anna and Paul, could you speak to that before we close?
Sure. This is so what we looked at, as you can tell, all the ridership analysis is based on annual data. And so it does represent kind of the full set of travel, and that was estimated. The underlying origin and destination information was gathered from spring and fall months. What we've looked at, because that tends to be average, it lacks the peaks of the summer and the valleys of the winter as far as travel volume. So what we would expect is the best answer I can say is that we would expect the same number of annual visitors as predicted, but you would see higher volumes of ridership in the summer, and you'd see tend to see lower volumes of ridership in the winter. So that's how it's reflected in what we looked at. But there are definitely seasonal draws and different events to kind of add peaks and valleys to what kind of ridership you'd see on a day-to-day basis.
And I think adding some of the local stations provided additional opportunities for use of those attractors, even with the one schedule.
Yep.
Thank you. And thank you, Leo, for that question. And so with that, thank you all for being here today and for your participation throughout this process. I encourage you to visit the study website to share any additional comments or questions that you might have using the comment form, or to sign up to receive study updates if you have not already. The materials from this meeting, including the video recording, will be made available on the study website. And so with that, that concludes today's meeting. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you all.